9:12 a.m., June 24th, 1944, near the hedgerows of Saint-Lô, France. Major Hans Kessler of the 2nd Panzer Division stands on the stone balcony of a captured chateau. He adjusted his collar, the silver knight's cross catching the morning sun. Behind him, 11 other high-ranking officers gathered over a map of the American 29th Infantry's flank. Kessler felt untouchable. He was 550 yards behind the front line, well beyond the effective range of any American rifleman. To him, the Americans were sloppy, relying on volume of fire rather than precision. In the next 40 seconds, Kessler and every man in that room would be dead. While the German officers debated their counterattack, Corporal Silas Thorn lay 4 stories up in the rotted hayloft of a collapsed barn. The air was thick with the stench of fermented corn and the copper tang of old blood. He wasn't using a standard-issue sniper rifle. He was cradling a Springfield M1903 with a modification that was explicitly forbidden by high command. This was the moment that flipped Army doctrine on its head, a moment of civilian logic that was nearly erased from the history books because it was born from an act of defiance. Before the draft, Silas Thorn didn't know a thing about reconnaissance or West Point strategy. He was a loom fixer in the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts. His entire world was measured in microns. He spent 12 hours a day using high magnification lenses to align steel needles on massive high-speed weaving machines. If a needle was off by the width of a human hair, the silk would shred. He learned to think in angles. He learned how light bent through glass and how vibration affected a steady hand. When he enlisted, his instructors at Fort Benning were baffled. Thorn didn't aim like the other recruits. He complained that the standard Army blade front sight was too thick. At 500 yards, the metal post was wider than a man's chest. It was blind shooting, he called it. He began experimenting with unorthodox field modifications, filing down his sights to razor-thin points. His sergeant called it vandalizing government property, but Thorn saw it as correcting a fatal flaw in the anatomy of the American rifle. The situation at Saint-Lô was desperate. The German command post in the chateau was a black hole for American lives. Any attempt to advance was met with pinpoint artillery fire directed by the officers on that balcony. The Army's rigid doctrine dictated a frontal assault with mortar support. It was a suicide mission. PFC Leo Moretti, 19, from Brooklyn, a former delivery boy who sang opera in the foxholes. He was cut down 20 yards from the hedgerow. His mother would keep his last unread letter, the one where he promised to be home for Sunday gravy, on her nightstand for the next 50 years. Sergeant Arthur Pop Miller, 34, a carpenter from Ohio. He had a 6-year-old daughter, Clara, who wore his dog tags every day until her own passing in 2014. He died trying to suppress the balcony with a Browning automatic rifle that simply didn't have the reach. Captain Sterling, a man with pressed fatigues and a West Point ring, refused to let Thorn take a long-range shot. "The manual says the effective range is 400 yards, Corporal," Sterling snapped. "I won't have you wasting ammunition and giving away our position with your tinkering." Thorn ignored him. That night, under the glow of a shielded flashlight, he performed his heresy. He took an industrial sewing needle he carried from the Lowell mills and soldered it into the center of his scope's reticle. It was an improvised fine wire sight. Standard sights were blunt instruments. Thorn's needle was a surgical scalpel. He used a piece of gum and a spent casing to shim the elevation, calculating the 550-yard drop with a mathematician's coldness. When Captain Sterling found him the next morning, he threatened Thorn with a court-martial for unauthorized field modifications. Thorn didn't argue. He didn't salute. He simply waited for the morning fog to lift, grabbed his rifle, and crawled into the no-man's land between the lines. He was going rogue, operating on a logic the Army hadn't yet invented. The hayloft was a pressure cooker. Sweat soaked through Thorn's wool uniform, stinging his eyes. The smell of the fermented grain was dizzying. He looked through the glass. At 550 yards, the German officers were tiny specks, but through the sewing needle sight, Thorn could see the buttons on Kessler's tunic. He accounted for the 4-degree downward angle and the light crosswind coming off the English Channel. 550 yards, 14 inches of bullet drop. He exhaled halfway, held, squeezed. The Springfield kicked. The .30-06 round traveled for nearly a full second. Major Kessler's head snapped back before the sound of the shot even reached the chateau. Thorne didn't pause to celebrate. He worked the bolt. Clack, clack. The next officer reached for Kessler. Thorne's needle found his throat. Squeeze, impact. The Germans scrambled, but they couldn't see where the fire was coming from. They were used to the spray and pray of American squads, not this invisible reaper. One by one, the 12 highest-ranking officers in the sector were systematically erased. Thorne's hand never shook. He wasn't a soldier in that moment. He was a mill worker, ensuring the needles hit their mark. By noon, the German command structure in St. Lo had evaporated. The 29th Infantry moved forward without losing another man that day. 12 shots had saved hundreds of American lives. Months later, the Army began investigating how a single corporal had achieved impossible hit ratios. They eventually adopted fine wire reticles as official doctrine, but Silas Thorne's name was never on the patent. His sewing needle modification was noted in a disciplinary file, then buried. When the war ended, Thorne didn't stay in the military. He didn't write a book. He went back to Lowell, Massachusetts. He returned to the noise of the textile mills, spending the rest of his life making sure the machines ran straight. He never spoke of the 12 officers or the barn near St. Lo. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet man who was very good with his hands. He had looms to fix. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.